All right, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not here, but like I said, we're still moving on. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And this is going to be a two-part lecture. It's going to be all on this one PowerPoint, so don't fret. It's not going to be as long as you think. But of course, similar to in class, some things are going to happen. So the first thing I want to mention to you is this little definition I wrote here, which I would like you to write it in your PowerPoint presentation. It's the word metabolism, and metabolism is how you use and obtain energy. So your parents might tell you on a daily basis, boy, oh boy, you are eating me out of my house and home. Your metabolism is so high. And yeah, you know, they might be right here. Metabolism is how you use and process the energy that you get. So you eat other things, and at your age, you can just burn it off in your growth, but unfortunately for old farts like me, it doesn't quite work that way. So as you get older, your metabolism tends to slow down, and that goes with how you process energy, and that's a very big theme in this topic, is how you process energy. So hopefully you have that at this point. So we're going to move on. So I just want to let you know of a few things we've talked about this year. We talked about cells. We're going to talk about them a little more when I return with mitosis and meiosis. I've shown you respond to stimuli. You know that horrible thing where I kind of sit there and give you a quick jolt when I yell something and say, "Oh, I used your ATP." We've mentioned the word homeostasis in our first unit, maintaining a stable internal environment, and you don't have to mark or check these, but we're going to be talking about this in this topic, how you require energy and what you do with it. So what is energy? Well, energy is the ability to do work, and you survive off of energy. There's different types of energy. There's light energy from things like the sun, electric energy, and for us, heat energy is very important because that's what we tend to release. And right now, believe it or not, you need to maintain a stable internal temperature as you're a mammal. So you have to burn a lot of energy in order to keep that temperature. And that 3.3 pound gem between your ears, your brain, also needs a lot of energy. And in order to fulfill the requirements it needs, you need to release heat. So you probably know this big question: where does all energy come from? Well, we're going to be concerned about land with this, because sometimes in the bottom of the ocean or certain other places it can be a little different. But for us, we get all of the energy we use from the sun. And one of the big things we do in this topic is explain that. So organisms, in essence, get food two ways, or let's not say food, let's say energy. They get energy two ways, and you should be familiar with these terms. The term autotroph is organisms that make their own food, and let's not let this be the only organism here. Plants do this, some bacteria, some organisms called protists can be autotrophs. Autotrophs just make their own food, and that's generally through the process of photosynthesis. There's another process called chemosynthesis we'll talk about later in the year. So autotrophs make their own food. There's another word here you should write with that, and that's going to be the word producer, because a producer is synonymous with an autotroph. They produce food. Get that C-E-R. Again, remember, my name is sometimes Dr. Mackenzie, not because of my genius, my chicken scratch. So we also have heterotrophs, and you are a heterotroph. You cannot make your own food, unfortunately. You don't get to just chill outside and go through photosynthesis to make glucose. You have to actively find it and then consume it. So another word for heterotroph is a consumer. Consumer. S-U-M-E-R. Bam. So now, if we look at some of these, seaweed sits in the ocean, absorbs sunlight. It's an autotroph. Chicken, human, well, we actively hunt for food. We are heterotrophs. Algae and seaweed are pretty similar to each other. Algae is an autotroph. It has to make its own food. It's green. Apple trees. Well, it's a tree, it's a plant, so obviously it's an autotroph. And please don't forget, very important, mushrooms. You know that they are decomposers. Decomposition, and being a decomposer, is actively finding food too. You're just eating dead and decaying stuff. So mushrooms and fungus and decomposers are also considered heterotrophs. So let's look at this quick picture here. This is a little schema of how this whole process works. Here's Mr. Sun. It's shining down on this little plant here. And over time, this little plant with enough sun to go through photosynthesis will grow and turn into a big old apple tree. And here comes a heterotroph, a consumer, Farmer John. He's going to eat one of these apples. So it's important to remember. Farmer John here is getting energy from the apple tree. The apple tree got its energy from the sun, so indirectly, Farmer John here is getting energy from the sun. And that gives him energy to chop this tree down and, I guess, waste all those apples, because I don't know how he's going to eat them in one sitting. So why is that important? Well, the whole point of getting energy is to form this substance called ATP. And ATP, as it says, is a chemical compound used in cells to transfer energy. So it's called adenosine triphosphate, and it's a pretty easy thing that happens here. Right now you're looking at ATP. All right, this is adenosine triphosphate. Phosphate 1, phosphate 2, and phosphate 3. You want to jot that down there. You have a store of this in your body through a process called cellular respiration. And when you do everything from laugh or roll your eyes at my silly jokes I'm going to say in this, to, I don't know, jump up and down and all the silly things you do, write down things on a piece of paper, chew your gum, look at your phone when you think no one's looking. What your body and your cells are actually doing is they're removing this third phosphate group. And by removing it, you get a big old kapow. That's a kapow. It's not a very good cacao, but that kapow is energy. All right, so by removing that third phosphate, you release energy. And when you remove it, you no longer have ATP, not 3 phosphates. You have ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So when your body needs energy, it removes the third phosphate. In the process of cellular respiration, we'll talk about later in this unit, you attach this third phosphate back on, and you, in essence, have a storehouse of energy because of that. So that's pretty important to remember. You got to know those 1, 2, 3 phosphates. And you got to know that when you release this third phosphate, you release energy. So again, how does this work? It works by cleaving this third phosphate off, and bam, you get energy from ATP. So it's very important in the long run to remember ATP supplies you with the energy you need to do everything. All right? You might not notice that you need it at times. There's things that are going on in your body that you don't necessarily know or register. But you're still using this awesome substance that nature has made that we have been able to harness to do work. Now, besides ATP, there's a few other high-energy substances that are important. NADH, NADPH, and FADH2. I don't expect you to be able to write down that FADH2 is flavin adenine dinucleotide, but nonetheless, they work exactly like ATP. We said here that you remove the third phosphate and you release energy. Notice there's no phosphates here, but there are hydrogens. When we release these hydrogens, you also, just like with ATP, can release energy. And by attaching the hydrogens back onto these 3 states, you make a high-energy substance. So you'll see throughout this unit that these are just other high-energy compounds that your body can use. So let's talk about photosynthesis for a few minutes. Photo means light, synthesis means putting together or making. So this is the process of using sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen, and a very important high-energy sugar you really need to know at this point, called C6H12O6, also known as, and please write it, glucose. Glucose is one of the products of photosynthesis. So notice down here, this is a big one. You need to know this formula to succeed in this unit, and that just is something you're going to have to put some pure willpower and studying into to get down. So for each carbon dioxide, each 6 of them that you're releasing right now, plus 6 water molecules that are in the air, plus I need you to jot this down right here, energy from the sun, you can make, or not you, a producer can make glucose and oxygen. And I always think it's amazing if you think the 6 carbons in this carbon dioxide here, they're going to be turned into, in this process, the 6 carbons in glucose. So, yeah, something you exhale can turn into some of the food that you eat eventually. That amazes me, but maybe you'll get that down one of these days with the amazement. Get on my level of amazement with photosynthesis. So, let's talk about a plant real quick before we delve into the actual cell and into the chloroplast. You should be familiar with some parts. We're going to talk about a leaf, a stem, and a root real quick. And leaves are the most important part for photosynthesis because leaves contain a lot of cells that contain chloroplast. Chloroplast is where energy from the sun is used to make sugar in a process called photosynthesis. You also have these little holes in leaves called stoma, or plural form would be stomata. And they allow leaves to capture sunlight and carbon dioxide. And in essence, I'm going to jump ahead here for a second. These are the stomata, tiny holes in leaves, and they let carbon dioxide come in, and water and oxygen can leave. So one of the waste products you'll see of photosynthesis is oxygen. It's a product. And that's kind of nice for us because, well, we breathe oxygen. So the stem here is going to support the plant, and the stem is where a lot of growth occurs to bring these leaves closer to light. Roots, well, roots are important because this is where water comes into the plant and also other minerals for the plant itself. But you need water for photosynthesis, and you should be aware that roots are the main part of a plant that allow that to happen. So let's dive into this chloroplast real quick. So here's a plant cell in a leaf, say. And here, one of the organelles you should know is a chloroplast. If you notice with the chloroplast, you have these little membranes here. These little membranes are very important because they're one of the places where photosynthesis occurs. In fact, if you look at the board right now, you'll see 3 words, thylakoid, granum, and stroma. And I would like you to jot down here for a second where exactly, or what exactly those are. And I'll explain it while you're doing that. The thylakoid is a little disc. And this little disc contains chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment we'll mention in a second. And it's the site of what we call the light reaction. And there's a lot of those in this chloroplast, so obviously it's an important part. When you have a stack of those thylakoids, you have what's called a granum. It's just a stack of them, that's it. The stroma, this is an open spot in the chloroplast where the second part of photosynthesis occurs. You do need to be aware of what the thylakoid, stroma, and granum are and what they do. And throughout this process, you'll see. So, let's talk about light and pigments. So, light is actually a number of colors. And if you've ever put a prism up to light and seen a rainbow, then you know what I'm talking about. So, if someone in class right now is wearing a red shirt, it's important to remember that when you look at that color red on their shirt, what you're actually looking at is wavelengths of light that have not been absorbed by the pigments in that shirt. So if I'm wearing a red shirt, every color of visible light is being absorbed into the colors on that shirt except for the color red, and it's reflected back to me. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because plants have pigments too. They have really important ones called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll, interestingly enough, absorbs light like blue and red, but it reflects green, and that's why you see green plants as being green, because it's a color of light they're not absorbing for the process of photosynthesis. There is more than just chlorophyll. There's these things called carotenoids, which reflect yellow, orange, and red, and in the fall, when the chlorophyll goes away and the carotenoids are left behind, you see leaves as these colors. So there's a little answer to a fall question there. So we've talked about the stomata. let's talk about the actual process of photosynthesis. So, you have two reactions in photosynthesis. They're called the light reaction and the dark reactions. And unfortunately, like everything else we learn in science, it's not that simple. The light reaction is also called the light dependent reaction. I'm going to write DEP here for dependent. The light dependent reaction. Remember, RXN is what I tend to write for reaction. And in the light reaction, as you'll see in a second, you need light, hence the name light dependent, and you need water. What you get from this process are ATP and NADPH. So these are basically the products along with oxygen, which is released from the plant. And let's look at how that process actually happens. So here's a chloroplast. Again, here's your thylakoid. You want to put a T there for thylakoid, and you got a stack of them right here called the granum. Put a G there for that. So, when we go through photosynthesis, the first thing that happens is this. Light strikes a plant's leaf. The leaf itself is made up of cells, and inside of those cells is a chloroplast. Well, while light's hitting the chloroplast, water comes in. Water enters the thylakoid where there's chlorophyll. When light hits the chlorophyll, it heats it up, and that heating up of the chlorophyll does something to water. It's a noise you'll hear a few times in this unit. It's a big old karate chop. In fact, water comes into the thylakoid. Using energy from the sun, water is split in half. And what I mean is you'll have oxygen come out of the chloroplast. It's a waste product, and what's left behind is a bunch of hydrogens. Now these hydrogens are going to be used to make NADPH and ATP. Recall, these are high energy substances. So what you get at the end of this first process is oxygen and ATP and NADPH, and that's basically made with energy from the sun being used to split water. Water is H2O, there's your oxygen, there's your hydrogens. So, the second part of photosynthesis is called the dark reaction. I was smart enough here to also write the other names. It's also called the light independent reaction because it does not need light, or the Calvin cycle. It's called the Calvin cycle because that is the gentleman who found it. And any of these three names are valid, though they tend to be called the light independent or Calvin cycle most often. And this does not occur in the thylakoid. It actually occurs in the stroma, the open space in the chloroplast. You need carbon dioxide, and in essence, carbon dioxide is what we call fixed, turned into carbohydrates like glucose. So let's go back to this picture, and once again, when we start off this process, you have light hitting a thylakoid, water coming in. This is the light reaction. Water split. The hydrogens are used to make ATP and NADPH, and oxygen gas leaves. Well, after that, you have ATP and NADPH in the stroma. Along comes carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide enters the stroma, and it goes through a series of enzymatic reactions, or reactions with enzymes. Remember, enzymes speed up the rate of reactions. And the energy from NADPH and ATP is used to turn CO2 into sugar, like the most important one, C6H12 and an O6. I'm gonna write that again because that's really sloppy here. C6H12O6. How about we just say you jot down C6H12O6. So let's talk about this. Light energy is the start of this. When water split, the energy from light is then going to be found in these two substances, which in the Calvin cycle, or the dark reaction, you have ATP and NADPH, CO2 comes in, so when these are broken, these high energy compounds, they're used to actually turn CO2 into sugar again, and now the energy, which was originally in these substances and before that in light, is now going to be found in glucose. Alright, so again, you have energy from the sun. The energy from the sun is first found in these substances, and at the end of the process, it's going to be found in the sugar, and if you so happen to eat this plant, you're going to obtain that sugar. That's how you get your energy from the sun. So that's the process of photosynthesis, and this is a good summation of that. You have the light reaction, which again is dependent on sunlight, hence the name light-dependent reaction. Energy from the sun is captured by the chlorophyll, water split, oxygen leaves as a waste product, and ATP and NADPH are used to actually, in the next step, the dark reaction, turn carbon dioxide into sugar. So, why is photosynthesis important for plants? Well, this is how plants obtain sugar. There's another step plants have to do that we'll talk about in a little bit, where they break down that sugar, just like you and I. But plants, besides using it for growth and development, can also store some of their excess sugar. And one example of that is starch. If you've ever eaten a potato or a French fry, you have eaten starch. Basically, a potato plant photosynthesizes. Excess glucose is shuttled into the roots, where it's stored in what's called a tuber, in this case a potato, and eventually a farmer comes and pulls that potato out of the ground where that stored glucose is, and you go to McDonald's and you eat some French fries, and now you have the energy from those sugars the plants made. Cellulose is a building block of plant cell walls. In fact, plant cell walls are made of cellulose. So there's another use for it right there. The sugar can be used to build these cell walls here. So what are some factors affecting the rate of photosynthesis? Well, there's water availability. If you don't have water, you can't split it in the light reaction, so the process stops. So plants need water, just like every other living organism. Temperature and light. Think about this time of year. The temperature drops, daylight hours change. Because of that, leaves on trees around here, which are called deciduous, they'll drop their leaves, and when they drop their leaves, they can't go through photosynthesis anymore. So these two things are very important for photosynthesis as well. And lastly, nutrient availability. Is there enough phosphorus, nitrogen in the soil, things plants need to go through photosynthesis? So before we end here, I just want to remind you one more time. In the light reaction, water comes into a thylakoid. Energy from the sun is used to split water. Yeah. The oxygen from the water leaves the plant as a waste product. The hydrogens here that are left over, they're used to turn and make ATP and NADPH. Next step in the Calvin cycle, also known as the dark reaction, also known as the light-independent reaction, carbon dioxide gets shuttled into the stroma. These high-energy substances are used to fix carbon dioxide into sugars like glucose. And that's about it with photosynthesis. Here's some things that you should be aware of. You have some questions you're going to have to go over, which talks about a lot of this too. So hopefully that was helpful. We're going to stop here, and in a day or so, we're going to talk about the next topic, which is cellular respiration. Okay, let's talk about cellular respiration for a bit. So we've talked about photosynthesis, and it's important to remember now, all right? Photosynthesis makes sugars for plants, but plants, just like every other organism, has to take that sugar and break it down to make energy. And again, all organisms need to make energy in the form of ATP. So here's kind of a strange thought. A lot of people think plants go through photosynthesis and that's the end. They have sugar. Well, that's your thought process. You need to refine it, because once plants have that sugar, just like you, they need to go through cellular respiration. All right? So an autotroph just makes its own food, whereas a heterotroph, you, obtains its food. But in the end, all of you, everything that's living, has to go through cellular respiration. So this is the process by which organisms break down food, in this case glucose, to produce ATP or energy. There's two types of cellular respiration, what we call aerobic cellular respiration, which requires oxygen, and then there's anaerobic respiration, which does not. And Another name for this anaerobic process is called fermentation. So if you look here, once again, you better darn well know this come assessment day. This is the formula for cellular respiration, and it is pretty much the exact opposite of photosynthesis. Instead of starting with these substances, which we did last time in our last lecture, we're starting with the products of photosynthesis. So glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And you might want to refine that term energy and write the type of energy you get, which is energy in the form of ATP. All right? And we're going to talk about how this happens in a second. So this is the mighty mitochondria. The mitochondria is a lovely organelle that you should be aware of. Allows cellular respiration to occur. It makes energy. Now you need to remember it as being an organelle that makes energy in the form of ATP. So what happens when we get this ATP? And we've kind of talked about this to kind of remind you one more time. Here's phosphate 1, 2, 3. When you split and remove this third phosphate, you release a lot of energy that your body uses to do things. When you slam it back on there in this process we're about to talk about, you have stored energy that your body can use to do everything that it does. Oh my God, look at this picture. Well, this is something similar to the the photosynthesis picture from last time that you're going to need to know. So this is a three-part process in cellular respiration for aerobic organisms. We're going to start with aerobic. You, right now, are breathing oxygen. You're not doing much. You are an aerobic organism, so you're going to go through this whole process, but we're going to talk about at the end something that happens where if you're an athlete and you're running and you're lifting weights, you might not be able to go through this whole thing. This part right here with the mitochondria might be shut down, and we're going to talk about that at the end. Let me get this off here. So let's briefly talk about aerobic cellular respiration. You're going to start off with glucose. Through a process called glycolysis, glucose is going to be split. Yeah. Another hee-ah there. When glucose is split, it turns into pyruvate. Now, just by splitting that glucose, you're going to get 2 units of ATP. So just by splitting glucose, you get some energy. You also get another high-energy compound called NADH. And notice this is going to be shuttled eventually into what we refine as the electron transport chain. So here's glycolysis. You've split glucose, you get 2 ATPs. NADH is going to be shuttled into the mitochondria. Now you have this stuff called pyruvate. If you have oxygen in a mitochondria, this pyruvate will enter the mitochondria. And it enters into a process called the Krebs cycle. During the Krebs cycle, pyruvate is going to be broken down. And you're going to get a lot of NADH and another high-energy compound, FADH2. You also get 2 more ATPs. So, at the end of the Krebs cycle, you're going to start what's called the electron transport chain. We remember it as this. Oxidative phosphorylation is another word, but we're going to be concerned with calling this third step the electron transport chain, or ETC. You have a lot of NADH and FADH2 shuttled into the electron transport chain, and in essence, these hydrogens are going to be removed, and from doing that, you get 32 ATPs. So in this whole process of cellular respiration, from 1 glucose, you're going to extract 36 units of energy. If you have 1,000,000 glucose units in your body, which is common, think about how much energy you're going to be able to harness from that one molecule. So let's talk about glycolysis again. You need to remember, every organism on our planet, from the simple bacteria to you, to plants, to fungus, to protist, they all go through glycolysis. Glycolysis does not occur in a mitochondria. It occurs in the area outside called the cytoplasm. That's why in this picture here, this process is occurring in the cytoplasm, not inside of the mitochondria. So every organism has the ability to do this. You break down glucose, you split it in half, and you get 2 ATPs. And also remember, before we go on, besides the ATPs, you're also getting some NADH shuttled into the mitochondria. Step 2, the Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle. So, if you have oxygen in a mitochondria, you enter into the next step. And what happens is, the pyruvate, which comes from glycolysis, let's go back here, because some of you might say, well, he never mentioned pyruvate in that previous slide. Remember, glucose gets split, and when you split it, you end up with pyruvate. Pyruvate is going to be shuttled through a series of enzyme reactions where you end up with CO2. There's your carbon dioxide you're exhaling. 2 ATPs and a whole lot of NADH and FADH2. So, up to this point, you've only harnessed 4 ATPs, and it's important to remember the electron transport chain, which is the final part, is going to be the big last thing that gives you a lot of ATPs. So in essence, you're going to have energy shuttled in the form of hydrogen ions over a membrane, and in doing so, you're going to produce a lot of ATP. In fact, you're going to produce 32 of these ATPs. So if you go back here again, we have this NADH, FADH2. They enter into this cycle. They remove hydrogens, and those hydrogens get shuttled across the membrane, and in doing so, you get 32 ATPs. So from this process again, 2 to 32. Believe it or not, you need to know the numbers of ATPs that come from glycolysis, 2, the Krebs cycle, 2, and the electron transport chain, 32. All right. So that's a little summation of cellular respiration, and it's really important for you all to remember. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are intrinsically connected. Plants go through photosynthesis. They have carbon dioxide plus water with energy from the sun makes glucose and oxygen. Plants themselves then, and every other heterotroph on our planet, they're going to need to now take this glucose and oxygen and turn it into carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. So, even though plants go through photosynthesis, and let me say producers go through photosynthesis, they also go through cellular respiration. But if you notice here, glucose and oxygen is used in cellular respiration. When you use this process, you release ATP for work. You also release water and carbon dioxide, which is used in a plant in photosynthesis to create glucose and oxygen, which is used in cell respiration to make ATP, which you use for energy, and water and carbon dioxide. And then again, it happens again, and again, and again, and again. And it's a big old cycle the two play off of each other. So it's very important to remember. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cellular respiration and vice versa. All right? The products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cellular respiration. So they're intrinsically connected. So the last thing we need to talk about is what happens if you don't have oxygen or you don't have a mitochondria. Bacteria don't have mitochondria. Every other organism, every other thing which is eukaryotic on our planet does, but bacteria don't have them. So what do they do to get energy? Well, it's a pretty simple process that for some people is kind of confusing. So, interestingly enough, the first life on our planet appeared on a planet without oxygen. So life started with this process called fermentation. And really, fermentation is a fancy word for going through glycolysis. That's it. And let me say that again. Fermentation is a fancy word from just going through glycolysis. So, in the absence of oxygen, after glucose is split, the pyruvate will get changed into either ethanol or alcohol or lactate. If you're bacteria or yeast, you make ethanol. If you're a human and you've run too much and you run out of oxygen in your cells, which is common, you will produce what's called lactate or lactic acid. And those of you that have done sports before, think when you've had a really hard workout, the next day you're sore. That's because your cells and your muscles ran out of oxygen. And they have to revert to an ancient process called fermentation where they actually make lactic acid. And you might have heard in the past, lactic acid is what makes you sore. And that's the truth. You work out too much, your cells run out of oxygen, they ferment, they make this substance, and the next day you are sore. So how do these processes work? And before we do that, let me scan to this slide right here. So this is a good schema for both processes. Here's glucose, and here is your mitochondria, and this is the cytoplasm. So in glycolysis, glucose gets split into pyruvate. If you have oxygen in a mitochondria, you go through aerobic cellular respiration, which we've already talked about. If not, you go through what's called fermentation. So bacteria go through fermentation. Eukaryotes that have run out of oxygen, they also go through this process. Remember, you need oxygen for the Krebs cycle to happen. If it's not there, this mitochondria is basically invalid. It doesn't work. You need oxygen for this thing to work, and if your cells don't have it, well, that's a Chinese riddle. How can you have oxygen if it's not present? You can't. You go to an ancient process. Let's go back now to this slide right here. It's important to remember that let's start with alcoholic fermentation. That glucose gets turned into pyruvate. The pyruvate will then get turned into carbon dioxide and ethanol, and this is alcohol. So what you get from that, besides carbon dioxide and ethanol, is 2 ATPs. This occurs in things like plants, yeast, and please write bacteria. Bacteria are very big alcoholic fermenters. Alright. So for you, the best example for lactic acid fermentation is you. Let's say you're running again and your cells in your legs run out of oxygen. They can't go through aerobic respiration. They have to go through anaerobic respiration. In this instance, it's called lactic acid fermentation. You'll take glucose, your body will split it into pyruvate in glycolysis, but that's it. You can't use the mitochondria, so this pyruvate gets turned into lactate, and you produce 2 ATPs. A byproduct, because you're always going to be releasing it. You can write there CO2 as well. So you are a good example of this. You are a very good example of this. Your cells run out of oxygen. You go through lactic acid fermentation and produce 2 ATPs. And some of you might be saying, well, why can't we go through alcoholic fermentation? I mean, they're similar processes. Well, think about it. Let's say you're working out and you run out of oxygen. You split glucose, you get pyruvate, you get CO2, and you get ethanol. This is alcohol. If this fills up in your body, you will die from alcohol poisoning. It doesn't work that way. You go through lactic acid fermentation. So, again, when you do this in lactic acid fermentation, glucose is split into pyruvates, you get your 2 ATPs, and you get lactate and CO2. For alcoholic fermentation, pretty much same process. Glucose is split into 2 pyruvates, you get 2 ATPs. Those pyruvates are eventually turned into ethanol, which again is a type of alcohol. So, why is this process important? Well, this process is important because we use it to make things. Wine, beer, yogurt, sour cream, cheese, and if you've ever made bread, yeast is used to make bread. And yeast does produce alcohol, but in the process of cooking it, you burn it all off. And, you know, obviously these are big money commodities in our day and age. But it's interesting to know that this goes back 5,000 years. We might have been making some of this stuff using the process of fermentation for 5,000 years. Good Lord. And we're going to stop there, folks. That's it. That's a little recap of this. My suggestion, do your work. Look over this on your own time. Go over it. Answer the questions. And you guys will do just fine. All right. Good job.